right, so are you ready to get deep on this one? Today, we are taking a look at how we can use technology more intentionally, even strategically disappearing to hit those big goals.
Sure.
Our source material for this deep dive is kind of all over the place. I've got some personal notes on digital minimalism. We've got excerpts from Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism. And it's really, really fascinating document all about disappearing.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is that this isn't about like getting rid of all technology, right? It's more about seeing how tech can actually help us disconnect, and that can like supercharge your own personal growth, you know?
I love that. So first up, we're going to tackle digital minimalism, which I'm assuming is not just deleting a couple apps.
You got it right. It's way more about filtering out that digital noise so you actually focus on what matters in your life. We've got this great example. Tyler, his story's in one of the sources, and basically he dropped all social media cold turkey and saw huge changes in his life, better relationships, even a promotion at work. He got laser focused.
Okay, so no social media at all. That's pretty intense. His story actually reminds me of the whole attention economy thing, though. I'm guessing this isn't like, a prize for longest attention span, right?
No, not quite. It's about how companies are literally fighting over every second of your attention. They're using these, pings and notifications and never-ending scrolling to basically keep you hooked. The goal, get you to buy more stuff. It's almost like we're stuck in this system that's meant to distract us, even when it's not good for us.
I mean, it's kind of scary when you think about it like that. Even some of the people who design these crazy addictive technologies are realizing there's a problem. One of the sources mentioned this guy, Tristan Harris. He was a designer at Google who became this attention resistance advocate. And he had this moment where he realized the same design tricks that were making products engaging were being used to manipulate people. He calls it attention engineering. Pretty spot on, don't you think?
Totally spot on. And that's where, critical use comes in. This idea of only using technology if it's actually giving you something valuable. It's interesting. This is actually a huge issue for companies that depend on you being glued to your screen. If everyone used their tech intentionally, places like Facebook would see their profits drop dramatically.
Wow. Okay. So we're basically up against these massive corporations. It's feeling like David and Goliath here.
Yeah.
How do we even start to push back? Are there any groups out there who have figured this out, like navigating the attention minefield?
There are, and this might surprise you, but one group is the Amish. They get the stereotype of being anti-technology, but it's way more nuanced than that. They've got this really interesting way of evaluating new tech. They watch people who are early adopters and see if the technology is going to help or hurt their community. Then they decide if they're going to use it.
So they're not just, rejecting any kind of progress. They're really careful about what they allow into their lives. That's a pretty smart strategy when you think about it. This world is always trying to sell us the next big thing. Right. What if we all took a similar approach? Even just a little bit.
It's something to think about for sure. What struck me, though, was how much they focus on the well-being of the whole community. It's not just what's good for one person. It's about how this technology is going to affect everyone.
That's a really cool perspective. And it makes a lot of sense. Technology impacts our attention, spans our mental health, even our politics. It's not just about our individual choices anymore. It's about creating a culture where focus and being intentional are actually valued.
That's exactly it. And this all connects to another key part of the puzzle, solitude.
Solitude. In this hyper-connected world, it feels like a rare thing. Is it really that big of a deal?
More than a big deal. I'd say it's essential. For deep thinking, processing your emotions, even being creative, you name it. We're so connected all the time that a lot of us are experiencing solitude deprivation. Basically, we almost never experience true solitude. And the research is clear. This hurts our mental health, it makes it harder to focus, and we lose our capacity for original thought.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how all of this ties together.
Yeah.
But how are we supposed to find solitude when we're constantly being hit with notifications, messages, and updates?
That's where the idea of disappearing strategically comes in. Now, I'm not saying you need to go off the grid and vanish completely. It's about taking a step back from all the social pressures and those digital distractions so you can focus on your own growth without needing validation from everyone else.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued now. Disappearing sounds like it could be a really powerful way to reclaim your time and attention. But how do you actually do it effectively? Is there like a step-by-step guide or something?
There is, and it's pretty straightforward. The first step is shut your mouth. I mean, literally. Stop telling everyone about your goals and what you hope to achieve. You'd be surprised how much energy it takes to constantly be talking about what you're doing instead of actually doing it.
That's true. It's almost like we're always performing for an audience instead of just focusing on the real work. Plus, when you share your plans with everyone, you open yourself up to their opinions and doubts.
Exactly. You keep your goals to yourself, you protect your focus, and you can work without feeling pressure from external expectations. Then the next step is only care what you think.
Now that sounds like a big mindset shift. How are we supposed to train ourselves to actually value our own judgment over everyone else's opinion?
It takes practice. One technique from the source is to picture yourself as two people, the person you are now and the person you want to become. That future self can be like an internal mentor helping you make decisions that line up with your goals and values.
I love that visual. It's like having this internal compass guiding you through all the noise and helping you stay true to yourself. Okay, so we're keeping quiet, tuning out the outside world, and focusing on that internal compass. What's next on the disappearing agenda?
Next up is hide your plans. Basically, treat every time you talk about them as a potential setback. Yeah, it might seem kind of backwards, but the less you talk about what you're going to do, the more likely you are to actually do it. And, keeping things under wraps lets you just get to work without having to constantly explain yourself and give updates to everyone.
It's like creating your own little bubble where you can really dive deep into the work and grow without all those outside distractions and expectations. I'm really interested to see how powerful this disappearing thing can be. But what about the digital world? How do we disappear when there are constantly notifications, messages, updates coming at us?
Well, that's where the next step comes in. Minimize digital distractions. It's all about consciously creating a digital environment that helps you achieve your goals instead of pulling you away from them. Imagine if we could choose what we see online instead of just being bombarded by whatever the algorithm throws at us.
I'm all for taking control of my digital life. But let's face it, some of these platforms are designed to be totally addictive. How are we supposed to resist that urge to constantly check social media when it's like designed to suck us in?
One source actually suggested something pretty radical, deleting all social media apps from your phone. Now, before you freak out, hear me out. It's not about quitting social media entirely. It's about changing how you use it. If you only access these platforms on your computer, you create this barrier to mindless scrolling, and you break that cycle of checking your phone every 5 seconds.
So it's kind of like choosing to sit down and have a delicious meal instead of constantly snacking on junk food. You actually get to savor the experience instead of just mindlessly consuming it.
Exactly. And when you do decide to use social media, remember the idea of using it like a professional. Think about how people who use these platforms for their work approach them. They have a plan. They carefully choose who they connect with, they share valuable content, and they engage in conversations that help them reach their goals.
I like that way of thinking about it. It's about being intentional with your social media use instead of letting it control you. Speaking of being intentional, what about the news? It feels like we're drowning in information these days, and so much of it is negative and stressful. How do you stay informed without getting pulled into all that negativity?
That's where the slow media movement comes in. It's all about focusing on quality over quantity, really taking the time to absorb information and engaging with media in a more mindful way.
Slow media. I like the sound of that.
Mhm.
But what does it look like in practice?
It could be as simple as being more selective about where you get your news, avoiding those clickbait headlines, and actually setting aside time to read or listen to in-depth reporting. It's about choosing to really immerse yourself in a well-written article or a good book instead of just getting lost in that endless scroll of social media.
So it's like choosing to have a deep conversation with a wise friend instead of just overhearing random bits of gossip at a party.
Exactly. And it's about rediscovering the joy of thinking deeply and reflecting on things, really engaging with complex ideas without all the digital distractions.
This whole conversation is making me realize that we have a lot more control over our digital lives than we think. It's not about becoming a Luddite and rejecting technology entirely. It's about being thoughtful about our choices, setting boundaries, and creating a digital experience that's good for our well-being.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of making choices, the sources also talked about using technology to help us disconnect. There's this app called Freedom that lets you block distracting websites and apps for a certain amount of time. You can even block the entire internet if you need to.
Wait, an app that helps you disconnect? That's kind of ironic, isn't it?
I know, right? But sometimes we need a little digital nudge to help us break free from our digital habits. Think of it as a personal assistant for your attention span.
It's like having a bodyguard for your focus, protecting you from all the distractions that are constantly coming at you.
Exactly. And Freedom really highlights something important about being productive. Sometimes you have to limit your choices to get the most done. It's about setting boundaries that help you focus on the things that really matter.
That brings us back to the whole idea of disappearing intentionally. Creating a space where you can shut out the noise and reconnect with yourself, your goals, and your values.
Exactly. And it's not just about what we do individually. It's about changing the culture, creating spaces where being present and focused are valued. The sources actually mentioned the Alamo Drafthouse Cinema as an example. They have this strict no talking, no texting policy during movies, which is pretty refreshing compared to most theaters where everyone's on their phones.
Oh, I love the Alamo Drafthouse.
Yeah.
It's so nice to be able to watch a movie without all the distractions of glowing screens and people chatting. It makes you realize how rare it is to have those moments where everyone is just focused on one thing.
Yes. And it shows us that we can create spaces, both physical and digital, that support our ability to pay attention and engage deeply. It's about setting boundaries, making conscious choices, and sending a message that being present is more important than being distracted.
This whole conversation about disappearing is really sticking with me. It's
Yeah.
not about checking out of life completely. It's about checking in with yourself, your goals, what you really value.
Exactly. And it's about realizing that true fulfillment often comes from the things we do in private, the skills we develop, the challenges we overcome, the relationships we build.
It's about taking control and shaping our own lives, both online and offline. And that brings us to another really interesting part of this conversation, the difference between connection and conversation. It's like we've been talking about disconnecting and, like disappearing. But one thing that keeps popping up in these sources is how important social connection is for us as humans. It almost seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, it is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? It all goes back to how our brains are wired. The sources actually talk about this thing called the default network. It's this network of brain regions that become active when we're not really focused on a specific task.
Interesting. So what's so special about this default network? Does it have something to do with like our social lives?
It does. It turns out that this default network goes into overdrive when we're thinking about social interactions. Like our brains are constantly replaying our social lives, even when we're not actually interacting with people. When you think about it, it makes sense. For most of human history, our survival depended on being able to cooperate and connect with each other.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not just that we like hanging out with people, it's like built into our brains. But here's the thing. So much of our social interaction happens online now. Are we getting the same benefits from these digital connections?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the sources talk about this idea of connection versus conversation.
Okay, so break that down for me. What's the difference?
Well, think of connection as those quick little interactions we have online. Like liking a post on Facebook, retweeting something on Twitter, sending a quick text message. They're easy and fast, but they don't have the same depth as a face-to-face conversation.
So it's kind of like the difference between fast food and a home-cooked meal.
Hmm.
They can both fill you up, but one's definitely more satisfying.
I like that analogy. And then you've got conversation. That's the really rich communication that happens when you're with someone in person. It's not just about the words you're saying. It's about body language, facial expressions, tone of voice. It's a total sensory experience.
And it sounds like something our brains are craving even if we don't realize it. But how do we make time for those meaningful conversations when we're so used to connecting online?
Well, one of the sources actually suggests something called conversation office hours.
Okay, so now I'm
What?
picturing a therapist's office, but for hanging out with friends. What's that all about?
Oh, it's much less formal than it sounds. It's just about setting aside specific times when you're available for a phone call. You let your friends and family know about these office hours, and they can call you up whenever it works for them.
That's such a cool idea. It takes away that awkwardness of calling someone out of the blue and makes it way easier to have a real conversation. It's like having a standing invitation to just chat.
Exactly. And it encourages people to actually have a conversation instead of just sending a quick text or an emoji.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've covered so much from digital minimalism to, the neuroscience of our brains. And I have to say, I'm feeling a lot more appreciation for the power of intentionally disconnecting.
Me too. It's not about rejecting technology entirely. It's about understanding how it affects us and making smart choices that make our lives better.
It's about deciding what we let into our lives and what we keep out.
Yeah, absolutely. And remembering that real connection doesn't always happen through a screen. Sometimes the best interactions are the ones where we're face-to-face talking and really connecting with each other.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining me, and until next time, remember, disconnect to reconnect.